Now let's take what we've learned so far, drill in a little bit deeper. In this next section, we want to begin talking about how we use the view to actually design the visible portions of the user interface. So, what is the view? As we've seen earlier, the view is the visualization of the user interface. So, the view is not ever visible on its own. It always must be embedded inside another window. So there's no call view or display view or anything like that. Uh, the view itself always has to be surrounded by a window. Even when it's a pop-up, a dialogue, you actually produce the dialogue of a window, and then it's the one or more views embedded in the window that describe what will appear on the screen. The view is obviously what contains the UI elements that will appear on the screen. And once again, just to really hammer home this topic, no HTML, no scripting. You'll see it here in a second when we go into the system. It's drag and drop, definition of UI elements, properties, events, but not actual scripting. So, what are UI elements? I think this is pretty straightforward. It's the things that appear on the screen. It's buttons, it's input fields, it's tables. Some of the UI elements are quite complex and almost like composite elements. The table, for instance, has multiple columns and all kinds of interesting things you can do with it. And then some are as simple as an icon or a button. SAP supplies a library of the UI elements, and currently there's no way to extend that library. So SAP essentially controls all the UI elements that are available in WebDynPro. Each UI element obviously has properties. That's the property box that appeared when we selected a UI element in the view editor. And SAP also defines what all properties are available for a UI element. And that controls different aspects of the rendering. So it might control the color of a button or the color of a background of an input field. Or it might control whether an input field is required or something like that. And many of these properties can be bound to data in our context. We'll see later what exactly that means. But basically, what I'm getting at is that not every property has to be defined at design time. We can supply dynamic values to properties as well, and that's where things get really powerful. You don't have to write code necessarily to dynamically change the user interface, to hide fields or change their position or something like that. A lot of this can be done via bindings to the properties. So we do have container UI elements types. There are various UI elements that are containers, like a tray or a panel, a group, and then we can embed or nest other UI elements within them. Now, the screen design in WebDynPro is flow based. So when we put something on the screen, we're not saying put it exactly at this XY coordinate. That's not how screen design works in WebDynPro. That was the way classic Dynpro worked. Put a button on the screen and it was exactly in that XY coordinate position. Now, WebDynPro being in the web browser, we don't necessarily have as much control over the screen size. As the user resizes the screen, we want the UI elements to sort of perhaps float to take up the available screen real estate, not necessarily scroll off the screen. That's part of the reason why WebDynPro uses a flow-based layout. Also, it means that we do a lot with hierarchies. So we group things together. You saw the hierarchy view in the top right-hand corner of the View Designer. It's important to understand what UI elements are nested within each other, because that has a lot to do with the flow of the layout of the UI elements when it comes to runtime. Alright, so this is really a blown up version of what we saw earlier, the View Designer inside the ABAP development environment. I just want to, before we go into the system in a second and create our first little hello world application, I'm going to spend another minute reviewing the the workings of the view layout. On the left-hand side of the View Layout Designer, we have our toolbox of all the possible UI elements. Actually, it's not all the possible UI elements. Some of them can't be, aren't necessarily visual. Some of them can't be added via drag and drop. Later we'll talk about some of these special UI elements and how they can be added, but it's the majority of the UI elements. You can drag and drop them onto the inner area, the view layout area, or the canvas as I would call it. So you can drag and drop them and build up your user interface, and that is a pretty nice WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get version of the screen that you're building up. On the far right hand side at the top, we have our tree of all the UI elements. And as I said earlier, this is pretty important because it shows you the relationship between the UI elements, the nesting of the UI elements. And my personal preference is I work very heavily with this tree area. I do almost all of my work up in the tree. And the WYSIWYG designer is nice, and the drag and drop demo is very nice, but for hardcore work, I often find that I can work faster with this tree. I can right mouse click on a UI element, embed another UI element underneath it in the hierarchy. You can drag and drop and reorder and move things around. You can delete groups of objects and do all that from the tree. Now, increasingly, we're improving the layout area, the main view layout area, and particularly in NetWeaver 7.0 Enhancement Package 2, the WYSIWYG preview was improved. We've also improved how many operations can be done from inside here. So not everything has to be done with the drag and drop. Now you've got some right mouse click context options to do cut and paste and things like that. Now the last section, the bottom right hand corner, this is the property box for the selected UI element, either selecting it via the layout. If you click on UI element in the view layout, it will position that in the tree and pull up the properties for that UI element, or you can do your navigation via the tree. You can click on an item in the tree, and it will draw the little, you see the little green dotted line around the last name input field. That's because that's the one I've selected, and its properties will be loaded as well. You can see there are a variety of properties per UI element, and we'll see a little bit more of that once we get into doing some data binding and talk about how we model the context. But for now, let's just focus on putting UI elements on the screen. This next slide, I put this in here mostly for reference, for you to look back on later. What I did is I took a screenshot of all the UI elements that are available in the toolbox, and they are grouped into different categories, and this is the same grouping that's used in the online help. So if you go to help.sap.com, and there's a section in the help for all the UI elements in WebDyn Pro ABAP, they are then grouped into folders or categories the same way that they're grouped in the system, and there is a help page, or at least one help page for each of these UI elements that explains all its properties and whatever other documentation is necessary for each one. And this does give you a little bit of an idea. I'm not going to sit here and describe each of the UI elements, but it gives you some idea of the wide variety of UI elements that are available in the system, and in WebDyn Pro in general, a pretty vast amount of UI elements. Certainly more UI elements than what we had in Classic Dyn Pro. The other thing that I should point out, that this screenshot was taken from NetWeaver 7.0 Enhancement Package 2. So it's sort of the latest version of all the available UI elements. And in your particular system, depending on the release level, you may not have all of them that you see here. So obviously, over time, SAP adds additional user interface elements. Okay, at this point, I think we've talked enough. It's time to go into the system. What I want to do is, without getting into too many of the other details about what's going on in WebDyn Pro, we want to create a simple hello world. So once again, the focus here is on the tooling and getting you comfortable with the amount of tooling in WebDyn Pro, in the ABAP Workbench that supports WebDin Pro ABAP that we've talked about up to this point. So I'm going to create a very simplistic and just put some UI elements in the screen. And obviously, we haven't gotten to the point where we've talked about how we model data, how we get data in and out of the screen, how we handle any kind of events. So we're going to keep it just up to that level, just putting some UI elements on the screen. So I return to my system and go back to the ABAP workbench. And there's a couple different ways that I could start creating a WebDin Pro component. And I'm just going to do these as local objects so as not to mess anything up in my system. I go to my local objects, or I could go to any package, and of course I could start creating a new WebDin Pro component if I just right mouse click and say create WebDin Pro component. I could also come up here to the other object menu and say web objects in my tab, so web objects, and then say WebDin Pro component, give it a name, and say create. Now my personal preference is most of the time I work inside my package hierarchies. I'm a fairly big believer in the use of multiple packages and nested packages to help organize development objects. So most of the time I've either already got a node for my object type, or maybe I come up to the package itself if it's the first thing that I've created in the package and say create WebDin Pro and component. So that's how I'm going to do this one. Now a little screen comes up. This is the first screen you always see when you're creating a new WebDin Pro component. So starting a new project from scratch here. Wants a name of the WebDin Pro component, so that's pretty straightforward. So Hello World WDA and Hello World WDA by me. The other thing that you have the opportunity to do at this point, and it's pretty nice, is we can go ahead and generate our initial window and our initial view. Obviously, if we're going to output anything to the user, we need at least one window and we need at least one view. We might as well go ahead and let the system generate the first ones for us and embed the view inside the window. Now, pretty early versions of WebDin Pro ABAP, like NetWeaver 7.0, SP 8, 9, 10, they actually had a simplified version of this create interface, and it didn't generate the initial view, and it didn't embed the view inside the window. So it was just some extra steps that you had to do, and it's nice that we don't have to do that anymore. Now, I personally usually prefix my windows with W and my views with V. There's no requirement that says you have to do that, and actually in your object hierarchy they're separated, so they're already separated out. It's not really very necessary, but it's one of those habits that I've personally and I've seen many other WebDin Pro developers have kind of gotten into that habit of doing. So it asked me object directory entry. As we said earlier, all WebDin Pro development fully integrated into the ABAP development environment. So as I create a new component, I could assign it to a package, and if I did put it in a package, of course, it would pop up and ask me for a transport. So like any other ABAP development object, fully integrated into the transport landscape. For my purposes, I'm just going to create this as a local object, and then of course it doesn't ask me for a transport. So I have my WebDin Pro component. If I open my component view, I would see there's my new component, and if I drill into it, you can see it's created a couple of objects already. It's created the component controller, so that's where I would put my global stuff. It's automatically generated a component interface for me, an interface view, which means my window. We're not really going to mess with that. At this point, we're really not going to do much with that at all. I'll point out later in the e-learning where we can expose certain parts of our component controller via the interface, but that's a much more advanced topic. For our purposes right now, what we're interested in is the fact that we have a view and we have a window. Now remember, the view is where we actually do the user interface design. That's where we get the view layout designer. So that's what's come up now. And we're going to keep this pretty simple. I've got a text view UI element. Let's just drag that onto the screen. So now we have a text view. Now the other thing that I could have done, besides dragging that on the screen, let me actually delete it. I could have inserted it over here by coming to my root and saying insert element. And then you get a little pop-up that asks you, okay, what name do you want? And if you're going to custom name things, it's a little nicer way to do that than dragging and dropping, then having to rename it in the properties later. So let's say text hello world. And then you get a drop-down list box with all the UI elements types. Now they're not grouped, but once you get to know the names of the UI elements, you can kind of type and it'll take you right to that spot. So you kind of see there's different ways. When you're kind of new to this, you do a lot of the drag and drop from the toolbox. Once you get pretty experienced, I find that it's easier just to type the UI element type names. But either way, we end up with a UI element on the screen. That's what we ultimately wanted. And now we have property boxes here, one of which, a required one, it was in red, so we know it was required. So some text, I can say hello world. Very nice. If I wanted to change, what's some of the other properties we might want to change here? We might want to change the semantic color. I want to change that so it comes out, what color is critical? Maybe we'll do negative. There we are. And notice the colors are not like red, green, blue. It's because the colors are going to be taken from the theme. So we can't specify exact colors, exact fonts. Instead, we use semantic colors, and then the actual color is applied by the theme. And we'll talk more about theme later when we talk about Portal. The other thing, we can change the design. Maybe we want to make this bigger. Once again, I can't just specify the font type and the font size, but I can do these pseudo adjustments for header here. That'll make it a little bit bigger. There we are. So now I've got my hello world. Not very exciting. Maybe I want to make this look a little nicer. Let's go ahead and insert a panel, which is a UI element that helps us group things together. So panel hello world. We'll say it's a panel. Very nice. I want to change the design here. I like the plain panel, so I'm going to make it a white background. And then I'll come here and say maybe my title, hello world. That's all fine. But now, what's the problem? My hello world up here, my text, is outside of my panel. How can I put that inside my panel? Well, that's pretty easy. I can just drag and drop it, and now it's indented. It's inside the panel. So I kind of did that on purpose. I waited to put my panel in later to show you how easy it was to reorder and nest UI elements within group UI elements. But I think you get the idea. Very basic example, but you know, it shows you the power of the View Designer. Now the other thing that I want to do, I want to go to the window, and at this point there's not really anything that I had to do here because I have a window. I only have one view, and that view is already embedded within this window. Later in some of our more complex examples, we'll see situations where we have more than one view, and we also have navigation between views. And that's really where the window comes into play. We have this concept of plugs that we'll talk about later that allow us to perform navigation, swap views in and out of the screen, and we'll see that a little bit later. But for now, our application is ready to go. I will go back here to my component itself. I will activate everything. I better not have any syntax errors, but it would do a check at that point. And I'm ready to go. I'm ready to run it, except there's nothing to execute yet. A component itself isn't executable. Very much kind of like a program isn't really executable. It can be through the test tools and through SE38, but you know, a component not executable at all. we have to create an application. And I'm going to create the application with the same name as the component. It's not required. I can give it any name I want. And I can give it a description. This description that I give the application is what will appear in the browser header bar. So hello world, and it automatically pulled in my component and my view or my main window because that was all I had. If I had more than one, I could come here and I could choose. If I had more than one window, I could come here and I could choose which one I wanted to start up with, or which one wanted to be my default. But since I only had one, defaulted in. I could also come here and add certain parameters. There are parameters that can control the different aspects of the rendering. For now, we really don't have to get into any of these parameters. This is much more advanced, but just letting you know that the option is there. You'll see I have a unique URL. The URL is made up of the WebDynPro application name. That means I have something that can be executed now. I will save this. I will execute. And my browser window opens, and I have my Hello World application. Certainly not the fanciest application in the world, not the most robust, but you can see how quickly you can go from designing to executing the application with very few intermediate steps.